Welcome to St. John Vianney Catholic Church and to Catholics called to care for our common home. We thank God that you are able to join us this evening, whether you are attending in person or remotely via live stream. As together we deepen our understanding about the crisis facing our common home and discover additional actions that we as people of faith can take to defend our common home. Please rise as our pastor, Father Vu, leads us in prayer.
Thank you, Ms. Ron. Hello, everyone, and welcome to SJV, a Light of Christ on Finn Hill for all peoples. And we are very grateful for Mr. Jeff Renner, who is here with us today, taking the time to be with us and share insights and wisdom and knowledge on forming our conscience and helping us to make good choices and decisions to care for our common home. And we're also grateful to God for the Justice Commission and for Susan Weaver helping to organize and host this event today. And I'd like to share a prayer for our earth composed by Holy Father Pope Francis. And just to let you know that this prayer is printed on recycled paper. Yeah, and the paper will be recycled afterwards too. So I invite you to bow your heads and join me in prayer. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, P-R-E-Y. That we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. So let us pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Father. As we learn about the crisis facing our common home and some of the things that we can do about it, it is also important that we reflect on our relationship to the world around us, to the world that God has created and placed around us. If we turn to the book of Genesis and to the two creation stories in Genesis, we find conflicting accounts. In the first creation story, in chapter 1 of Genesis, humankind is given dominion over God's creation. Chapter 1, verse 26 of Genesis reads, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth.'" In fact, the word dominion is repeated twice in that section of Genesis, in the first creation story. And it reflects that God has given humankind control over all his creation, has put it at his disposal, has given him command to do with it as he pleases. The mandate is more restrictive, however, in the second creation story in Genesis. In chapter 2, verse 13 of Genesis, we read that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. So rather than having dominion, humankind is to till and to keep. Rather than being the owner, humankind is the caretaker. So which one is it? Psalm 8 offers a commentary on the first creation story of Genesis. The psalmist makes it completely unambiguous how he understands the meaning of dominion and how he interprets the relationship between humankind and God's creation. The psalm reads in part, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have established, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" So in comparison to the majesty of God, man is insignificant. But the psalm goes on, "Yet you have made him little less than God. You crown him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea." So the psalmist believes that humankind does have dominion, does have the right to rule and command God's creation, is almost a God over this earthly domain. But is that the last word? We know that portions of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are prophetic. For example, Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15 read, "The Lord God said to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." In the history of the early church, this is called the Proto-Evangelium, or the first gospel. It's a prophecy about the coming of Christ, of the enmity between him and Satan. Satan will bruise his heel, as he does when Christ goes to the cross, and Christ will bruise his head, as he does by defeating death. That's not the only prophetic verse in the Torah. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, Moses tells the Israelites, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me," that is, a prophet like Moses, "from among you, from your brethren, and him you shall heed." In the history of the early church, this verse was seen as prophetic, a prophecy about the coming of the prophet of the new covenant, a prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. We also know that the Old Testament points forward to the New Testament, and the New Testament fulfills the Old. The New Testament also clarifies, adds clarity to the Old Testament, helps us to define its meaning, helps us to understand it. So if we turn to chapter 2 of the letter to the Hebrews, the author offers us an extended commentary on Psalm 8. He begins, It has been testified somewhere. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. If that verse sounds familiar, it should. That's a variation of the quotation that we read earlier from Psalm 8, the psalm where the psalmist thanks God for giving humankind dominion despite his insignificance in comparison with the majesty of God. But the author goes on, now in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. The him and the his here refer to humankind. But then the author adds a major qualification to the psalmist's interpretation and to the way in which we understand the meaning of dominion. As it is, he continues, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. What the author is saying is that dominion has not been achieved. Dominion has not yet been given to humankind. Dominion is eschatological. We will have dominion in the new heaven and the new earth after the second coming, at the end of time. Jesus is the first fruit of that dominion. And why might we not have dominion? Because we do not yet have a close enough relationship with God. God does not yet dwell with us as he will after the second coming in the new heaven and the new earth. The division between God and man, between God and humankind, has not yet been erased. Our knowledge is incomplete, is imperfect, is insufficient to have dominion over God's creation. So in that case, what is our relationship to God's creation? We can get a better sense of this if we turn to the Canticle of the Creatures or the Canticle of Brother Sun, written by St. Francis. It begins, Most High, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, and the honor, and all blessing. To you alone, Most High, do they belong, and no human is worthy to mention your name. Praised be you, my Lord, and praised be you. In Umbrian is Laudato Si, the title of Pope Francis's encyclical on the care of our common home. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother Sun, who is the day and through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor, and bears a likeness to you, Most High One. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars. In heaven you form them clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Wind, and through the air cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather, through whom you give sustenance to your creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Water, who is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces varied fruit with colorful flowers and herbs. We notice that in the canticle, we are not in control of anything. We are not separate from or over anything. All creation, all created things of which we are one, are brothers and sisters. We are interrelated. We are interdependent. We are dependent on them. All of them to varying degrees. All of God's creation to varying degrees bears the divine image. And so St. Francis calls us to reflect on our relationship toward the world around us in a way that sees us as dependent, sees us as merely a caretaker, as recipients of God's grace, God's mercy, and God's goodness, just as the rest of creation is the recipient of God's grace and God's goodness. I'd now like to introduce our guest speaker, Jeff Renner. Jeff has degrees in atmospheric science from the University of Washington and in journalism and political science from the University of Wisconsin. Before his retirement, he was chief meteorologist and science documentary producer at King Television and is a member of the Washington State Broadcasters Hall of Fame. He was interviewed for the first draft of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, and he has participated in a White House conference on climate change. Jeff is currently a member of the Western Washington Creation Care Network leadership team and is also executive producer and host of Challenge 2.0, a sequel to the television series started by the late Father William Tracy in the 1960s. And also, before I forget, at the end of Jeff's presentation and our closing prayer, there'll be time for a Q&A session with either myself or with Jeff. So please give a warm welcome to Jeff Renner.
Thank you. So first things first, can you hear me out there? Wanted to make sure the microphone is working. Thank you, Ron, for a very eloquent lesson there on that. And I know that we have some people that have either are or have been secular Franciscans here, and I reflected as you were talking about that. I think they appreciated that very much. I might ask you to just raise your hands if you've been active or are active in recognition of the work you've done. I know there are many people here that are parts of the social justice, am I going to get it right, ministry or committee, and also creation care. And so I might ask you to raise a hand and be recognized for all the good work that you do. And thank you very much as well. And maybe we'll get some, some added volunteers for your efforts as well. It's a delight to be here. I thank Ron and Susan very, very much for inviting me, and Father Vu, and I must admit, I'm sorry to say it, that I've never been in your parish before, and what a beautiful building, but more than that, the spirit of welcome that just emanated from everybody that I talked to as I walked in tonight. It's sort of natural to understand that some of my orientation toward creation care, toward climate change, is defined by the fact that I was chief meteorologist at King for many, many years. That was a very old picture, by the way, in the upper left-hand corner. Also as a science journalist, doing an interview in Rome, and we'll get a chance to see a small segment of that, but also because I enjoy being out in the wonder of God's creation, underwater, above water, in the mountains, and literally in the air. All of those help define my orientation to creation care and the need, the calling, if you will, to be protectors of that, to be in kinship with that. We'll talk about that. But I think at the very foundation, my Christian background, my Catholic background, is the defining foundation for all that I've sought to do over the last few years. It has been said that at its root, climate change and the environmental damage that we are seeing these days is not stemming from science or technical issues. At its heart, it's an issue of faith, it's an issue of our values, it's an issue of our ethics. And I find that to be very, very true the deeper that I get into either the research or seeing the effects of that. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, Jeff is up here, he's going to sort of do the discussion for the next 40 minutes or so, but you're not getting off that easy. We're going to have a few questions for you at the very outset. So number one, and you don't have to answer these out loud, just think of, okay, how would I answer those? The connection of caring for creation with faith originated with A, Pope Francis, B, Pope John Paul II, C, Pope Benedict XVI, or D, Pope Paul VI. Okay, don't tell me. Just keep that to yourself. Question number two is, okay, 200 medical journals in the World Health Organization declared as the biggest threats to worldwide public health and life A, COVID, then climate change, then non-communicable diseases, things like cancer, heart disease, etc. B, COVID, non-communicable diseases, climate change, or C, climate change, then non-communicable diseases, and then COVID. Just mull that over a little bit. Laudato Si, the title of Pope Francis's encyclical, translates as, "Lift up all to you, Lord." B, "Praise be to you, Lord." C, "All is blessed, Lord." Just ask yourself. There will not be a test. The Ron, I think, has some test forms that he may pass out later on, but I have no control over that. What I'd like to do is start off our discussion this evening by taking you all, in our imagination, unfortunately, to Assisi, Italy. It's a wonderful place. My wife and I had the blessing of spending a week there, and we definitely want to go back. It was that rich of an experience. But what I do from the cathedral, the basilica there, just a little tone, and just welcome you to this discussion by saying, "Buonasera." Can we hear a buonasera? Good evening in Italian. So we'll hopefully get a little bit of taste of that. And if you visit, you may see this sculpture of St. Francis on a hillside overlooking the valley, deep in meditation, deep in prayer, deep in contemplation, but out where he loved to spend so much of his time, and that is out with all of God's creatures, all of God's creation. It's a wonderful place. It's in an area, or close to an area, called the Carcerian. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I think it's fair to say, and with some Franciscans here, I want to be very careful about this, I think it would be fair to say that Francis was not definitely on a path towards sainthood as a very young man. He was known, to put it, I think, fairly, a bit of the life of the party. His family was very well off. His father was a successful cloth merchant, and it's fair to say that Francis probably was going to go in that direction himself. He had dreams of even greater influence. He dreamt of becoming a knight, so he talked his father into giving him a war horse, suit of armor, and the training to become a knight. And that would be about like handing your kids the keys to a Porsche, and not an entry-level Porsche either. It was a big gift. He rode off into battle against neighboring Perugia, and I think he had these dreams of success on the battlefield, a very romantic idea out of it, and eventual knighthood and nobility. It didn't turn out quite that way. Francis ended up seeing many of his comrades in arms killed on the field of battle, severely wounded, and many were tossed into prison as he was, where he spent a year, and he was very, very sick. Eventually, I think the Perusians finally thought they had raised the ante on ransom from Francis's father as much as they possibly could. And so they said, "You go home." So he went home, but he spent very little time there, instead wandering the hills around Assisi. And I think it's fair to say he was broken in spirit. I think he had what we would describe today as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from his experiences in battle. And as he wandered these fields, he had the feeling that all the things that had a great attraction for him before, that called to him, that made a difference in his life, no longer had much attraction anymore whatsoever. And instead, he began to search for new answers, new direction, and one day he went into the little church of San Damiano, which was not in great shape. And he later told his friends when he prayed before this crucifix that the figure of Jesus Christ spoke to him and not through his mind, not in his imagination, but with his ears, and said to him, "Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is falling into disrepair." This is the church, and I think it's fair to say that initially Francis had the idea of taking this literally, that house meant church, and so he set about doing some repair work. But over time, it began to occur to him that that was not really the house he was called to repair. It was a community of believers, their relationship with God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and to live a life informed by gospel values. And so he changed his direction. We'll not get further into that outside of the framework of Laudato Si. But in the spirit of Francis, and as I said, he is the foundation, he is the inspiration for it by his life, his ministry. Genesis 1, it also says, God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. Not just humans, not just some of creation, all of creation. Even as a young lad once pointed out, even the mosquitoes, Mr. Renner, even the mosquitoes. Sirach, the compassion of man is for his neighbor, but the compassion of God is for all living things. Some major changes there, as Ron pointed out very, very well. So in Laudato Si, they changed that call that Francis originally heard to God, go and repair my house, which as you see is falling into disrepair. And there is no doubt that our house, our life support system, our planet, is indeed falling into disrepair. What I'd like to do is examine those, not dwell overly long on those, but give you sort of a sense of where are we at right now from 2022 to 2023. There are 6 what I like to call flashpoints. Record mid-latitude heat, that's the part of the Earth that we live in, from the United States to Europe to parts of Asia. Record drought, record fires, record flooding, polar heat, and then ocean degradation. First, we're going to start with record heat. Do you remember, not last summer, but the summer before, when we hit temperatures well in the 100-degree range? It was called a 1,000-year heat wave. We hit or exceeded 100 degrees June 26th, 27th, and 28th, hitting 108 degrees in Seattle and 116 in Portland. And that was just one summer. Last summer, we hit 13 days of 90-degree heat. Now, I can tell you as a meteorologist that I had summers that we didn't have 90 degrees at all. We had a few where there were 2 or 3 days. We never had 13 days. And then if that wasn't enough, my wife and I came back from vacation mid-October figuring, okay, it's going to be rain, it's going to be cold. No, 88 degrees October 16th, and that was what, like 2 days after we got back, Sue? To put that in perspective, 29 degrees above the average high of 59 for that day. Now, this next one we're going to run out, this is data from NASA collected by meteorological sites all over the world, and it shows the trend of temperatures from 1880 forward to more or less the present time, 2022. You notice not a lot of change, some fluctuations a little bit cooler, some a little bit warmer. It wasn't until after World War I that we started to see a hint of a change, and it really wasn't until about the 70s or 80s that we started to see things really warm up in a serious way. And keep in mind that the possibility of climate change caused by greenhouse emissions was posited as far back as the late 1800s, but it was really becoming solid science as of the 1980s. And look at that, 2022 pushing way beyond normal. And where we saw some fluctuations before, if we turn this on its side, you get those sort of ins and outs of warming and cooling. But look at how it's been a steady trend since 1980. Okay, this is plus 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And now to put that in perspective, that would be, scientists are telling us that we cannot have warming of more than plus 1.5 degrees centigrade without major dislocations to the planet. We're at about 1.1 degrees right now, and we've seen what we're already experiencing. So I thought that was fairly useful. This is from the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. It shows that compared to the pre-1900 period, we've warmed up about 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit, close to 2, and projected, if the trend continues, we're going to be looking at temperatures about 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than average. When you have warming, very often we have drought, and we had that. This is a picture of Lake Mead. No longer much of a lake, at least not in that section. The western United States is in a mega drought. This is our flashpoint number 2. And in fact, scientific research has established that this is the worst drought in 1,200 years, and we've been 23 years into it. Mega drought defined as not just a one-year occurrence, but a multi-year occurrence, but we've been looking at it for 23 years. There are some publications that I think really give us pause, and this one, the Colorado River crisis is so bad, Lakes Mead and Powell are unlikely to refill in our lifetime. And I know we range in age here, but that's from the scientific research that we're seeing. Anybody in this room, they probably won't refill in your lifetime. The other article that came up is that there are growing fears of a dead pool on the Colorado River as drought threatens the Hoover Dam water. A dead pool means the water is no longer high enough to cover the turbines that generate power. The dam will no longer be a source of energy because of the water levels dropping. One hydrologist that I read, and this was in another article, but I thought it worthwhile to post up here, rivers are becoming irrigation ditches. Now, one of the things that I like to do in my spare time is fly fish. And I love being one with that part of creation. And yet this is telling me there's not a lot of future in that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Some of you may have heard of the dust bowls in the 30s and 40s, not experiencing it, but you see that definitely we were warmer than normal over North America, but look at how that was nothing compared to what we're seeing globally in 2021. Next aspect is record fires. You remember the Bolt Creek fire last summer? You couldn't get over Stevens Pass for several weeks. And we also know that we had horrible air quality. As a result, I'm not sure why that's coming up again. We are seeing a fairly steady trend. There are fluctuations from year to year, but just as the average temperatures across the western United States have been warming, so too have the number of fires, the scale of the fires, and the persistence of those fires. So the next aspect is record flooding, the next flashpoint. Record heat seems to want to get cameo appearances in there. Is record mega floods. One of the concerns of the Bolt Creek fire and any of these fires is once you burn the vegetation, there's nothing to absorb water and there's nothing to help stabilize the hillsides. And that's exactly what we're seeing. This was actually in Germany, where in Europe they lost 400 people in 2021. But we only have to look back to last December. Since December 26th, California had 9 what are called atmospheric rivers. An atmospheric river is when there's a flow from the tropics up into the temperate region. And it carries water content roughly analogous to the entire Amazon River. There's a lot of water up there. As a forecaster, I can tell you we typically have maybe 2, sometimes 3 atmospheric rivers in a season. And I retired about 7 years ago. I should say I started working at King when I was 15, so I'm not as old as it might sound otherwise. But we had 9 atmospheric rivers in California, 500 landslides. They're still totaling up the cost. And although they project 22 dead, they are understanding that they may not have found all the people that were lost. Just a winter before, 2021-2022, we had 7 atmospheric rivers here in the Pacific Northwest. There were at least 5 dead, and you could not get from eastern to western Washington or vice versa. All the east-west passes were closed, including, not a pass, but I-5 pictured there near the Chehalis-Centralia area. Elsewhere, we've seen, again, this major flooding, 400 dead in South Africa just last April, not quite a year ago. And in Pakistan last August, a third of the country was left underwater, and the fatalities were totaled at 1,500 people. So this is most definitely an effect on human life. Record polar heat, I won't go into that a lot, but I will say that in March of last year, just about a year ago, the Arctic ran 50 degrees above average. There was a place in the northern part of Russia, Siberia, that hit 100 degrees, and that's never happened. That was north of the Arctic Circle. Antarctica, 70 degrees above average, and we're seeing melting on land-based glaciers. This gives you a sense of the ice loss in Greenland. Greenland's glaciers are particularly of concern because those are land-based, so that water was not already in ice form in the oceans. It's running into the oceans. And they're estimating that the Greenland ice shelf could add 20 feet to sea level, not in the next 10 years, but over the course of the remainder of this century. The last element is ocean degradation, and as a volunteer diver for the Seattle Aquarium, I can tell you I've seen this firsthand. Warmer ocean waters from Puget Sound than we ever had in summers before. This gives you a sense. We talk a lot about the heating of the land and the atmosphere. Look at how that's dwarfed by what's been happening in the ocean. There was a period in the 80s when people never thought that we were seeing a break from climate change and actually said global warming has stopped. It hadn't. What was happening is we had a shift in the major patterns. You may have heard of them, El Nino, La Nina, and it was driving more of the heat into the ocean. Heat waves, as it says there, have doubled and intensified since '82, and one of the places is the Gulf of Mexico. The dark orange and the red areas of 90-degree Fahrenheit water or warmer, and those typically give rise to Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. We're also seeing, there was just an article I think it was last week, Dr. Kerry Emanuel from MIT said there is evidence showing that the worst effect of hurricanes is penetrating farther inland than it ever had before. The other effect that we're seeing here is one of our icons is salmon. Most of us enjoy eating them, but they define our area, and in a very real sense, they're an indicator of the ecological health of our area. The blue areas are zones where the water temperatures they need to thrive are present. Pretty good presence in the 2020s, though we've seen that shrink. But look at what this University of Washington study does. It shrinks them to small patches within about 20 years or 40 years from now. And that's going to have a spin-off effect in so many different areas. Laudato Si states, as often happens in periods of deep crisis, which require bold decisions, we are tempted to think that what is happening is not entirely clear. And we hear that. Sometimes I hear from people I know and like, oh, it's just a cycle. Well, it's maybe just a cycle, but look at this. This goes back 800,000 years. It's dissolved CO2 in ice cores. And you see that, yes, there is a fluctuation over a period of time up until the present, and you can see how that's off the chart. There were cycles before. This is no longer a cycle. And if we relate that to temperature, we can see the medieval warm period spiked up a little bit, but again, that's dwarfed by what we saw approaching in 2016, and 2022 would be literally off the charts. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, yeah, global warming, but how can you say that when we've had really cold weather here, 15, 16 at night? And certainly we do see variations from the average, but it's important to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this a couple different ways, that the U.S., even if the entire United States was below average temperatures, a major freeze, it only covers 2% of the planet's surface. It would be a little bit like saying, like a doctor saying to you, well, your little finger looks fine. I can't believe that the symptoms that you have in your head or your chest or your legs show that you're sick. You know, you have to look at the big picture, not just the little picture. We talked about how the Arctic is warming. As that warms, it's the contrast in temperatures between the tropical regions and the equatorial regions and the poles that define the strength of the west to east running winds, the opposite direction south of the equator. So as those temperature contrasts decrease, we end up seeing a weaker jet stream, and we get these major north-south undulations that allow the polar vortex. That was something I never would have said on the air. It was just something that we thought, okay, people aren't really going to be able to get a picture of that, but we hear it being used more and more. Basically, it's that it bottles up that cold air. And as it plunges southward, we get these big variations. The other thing that I often talk about is that when I was forecasting, we would see a pattern that would persist maybe 5, possibly 7 days. We're seeing them last 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks right now. And they are becoming much more persistent. As we said, as a result of that change, we're getting increasing long-duration events such as droughts, heat waves, cold waves, and also flooding. You've heard the saying from Will and Ariel Durant in their publications on history, civilization exists by geological consent. How many of you have heard that at one point or another? I bet you have. I came up with a different version, and that's it exists by meteorological and human consent, subject to change without notice, because that's what we're seeing. So the question is, who or what is the culprit? Is it us? The term anthropogenic climate change relates to human cause. So I think it's time to turn to the Sherlocks of attribution meteorology. So time to put our detective caps on. And we have to realize that the search for fingerprints began in 2003. Europe had a major heat wave. It's believed as many as 70,000 people died from that heat wave. The magnitude, the duration of that heat wave was such it had not been seen since the time, to put that in perspective, since Henry VIII was King of England. And that was farther than I can even remember. So what happened is, in asking this, they said, let's begin to do some scientific analysis. And they got the leading researchers from some of the leading institutions in North America, Europe, and now Asia as well, to begin to analyze these weather patterns and say, statistically and a variety of other factors, is there a fingerprint that points to climate change? And they were looking at 6 key elements: extreme temperatures, rainfall, floods, drought, snowfall, and storm surges, the rise in water you see before a hurricane or tropical storm. Key question here, it's not, did climate change cause a specific event all by itself, but rather, did it make it more likely, and did it increase the magnitude? So here are just a few things they found. And I put the website down here if you'd like to do some reading. They update this all the time on current weather events. The Northwest heat wave we had summer before last, virtually impossible without climate change. The Northern European floods that I said killed hundreds of people. There were some horrifying images of, this wall of water that moved through some of these towns. It was made up to 9 times more likely due to climate change. And the flooding in South Africa, twice as likely due to climate change. So we're seeing the scientific proof that they can tease out the influence of climate change and the warming in the atmosphere as causing or increasing the likelihood of these things. Father Thomas Berry had a quote that I find very apropos. All the disasters that are happening now are the result of spiritual autism. And I think that's true. So that leads us to, I think, one of the things that's very important in all of our lives, and that is the call of faith. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis states, some committed and prayerful Christians, with the excuse of realism and pragmatism, tend to ridicule expressions of concern for the environment. If you go to Assisi, and as I said, if you have not, I pray that you will and have that opportunity someday, you'll see this prone statue of St. Francis and a plaque nearby that says, "Who are you, God, and who am I?" I get the sense sometimes we are exchanging roles in thinking that original interpretation of dominion that Ron talked about, as opposed to, that being something yet to come. There's also a plaque nearby, this plaque, and on it says, Laudato Si mi Signore. Now remember that question? Per sora luna e le stelle, in cielo le formate clarite e pretiose e belle. And basically what that means, and this answers the question, is praise be my Lord. Remember that was, I think, the second choice of that line. For Sister Moon and the stars, in heaven you form them clear and precious and beautiful. So we turn to another interpretation that's put forth by Laudato Si. All of creation is not simply a collection of objects, it's a communion of subjects, and we are called to be in communion with all of those subjects. The Franciscan theologian Father Dan Haran said, we no longer believe the sun rotates around us, but some still believe the rest of creation does. And that's the attitude that we're called to change. We heard about dominion. I don't have time to go into the story of the Wolf of Gubbio. I love that. My wife and I wanted to, which I should say, here's Sue right down here. That's my wife. We had a great time in Assisi, and we went to the town of Gubbio where this took place, which, by the way, you can see the little box of bones of the wolf that the villagers took care of. But we got so lost trying to find this statue, didn't we? Finally, somebody took mercy on us and led us to that. But it shows that relationship that Francis was calling us to move beyond dominion, even beyond stewardship, to kinship, to being in communion. So in 2015, when the encyclical came out, we were going to Italy, one of a couple trips we've done back there. And I said to my news director at King, I'm going to be there. Could we get an interview maybe with somebody from the Vatican? Would you hire a photographer? And so He said yes. And so we ended up going to the Jesuit house there with the editor of the first edition of Laudato Si, and I'd like you to hear a few of the points that he made. While visiting Rome earlier this year, I had the opportunity to speak with Father Michael Czerny. He led the team that composed the first draft and offered insights on its motivation.
One is the scientific evidence, and the other is the experience and the suffering of the poor. And looked at from these two complementary angles, climate change is on the agenda.
On the assertion that humans have a right to use the Earth's resources however they wish.
And God doesn't exercise dominion rapaciously or irresponsibly. In fact, he does it very lovingly. And so it's a mistake to use the word dominion as a justification for the uncontrolled or the unmeasured exploitation of resources.
On the issue of waste and overconsumption.
When it becomes a kind of tranquilizer or antidote to unhappiness, then again it's not serving its real purpose.
On criticism by some that the Pope, a trained chemist, should be silent on climate change issues.
There where important decisions are made, that is where one's faith, one's values, one's character, one's vocation, one's destiny are played out. I think that's a pretty good definition of religion, and I think that's where religion has its contribution to make.
And Father Michael Czerny, by the way, now is Cardinal Michael Czerny, and he's speaking at Gonzaga, I believe, this next week, and he's scheduled to come back to Seattle, I think, a year from this summer, so you might have an opportunity to hear them. The next point that we talked about, who was really the origin of this, going back to Pope Paul VI, and in a real sense back to St. Francis. But Pope Paul VI said, due to an ill-considered exploitation of nature, humanity runs the risk of destroying it and with it themselves. Pope John Paul II, who was well known for his love of hiking and skiing and time spent outdoors. We were hiking in the Dolomites this last September and October, and we came across a part, and it was a rugged hike. It was not easy. And it had a plaque saying, Pope John Paul II hiked here when he was Pope. He made a point in his catechesis of January 2001 calling for a global ecological conversion. Pope Benedict XVI, often called the Green Pope, said the book of nature, that which God has created, is on a par with the book of Scripture, that we need to look to both for our relationship with the creation that God has made. And so that extends well beyond Pope Francis, so his approach in writing Laudato Si was neither novel nor new. So the question is, who suffers? And we get to the issue of environmental justice. Laudato Si states the gravest of all effects of attacks on the environment typically suffered by the poorest. There was a study done in Richmond, Virginia, and this was the beginning of a larger study, but as it was published in the New York Times, it made the point that the neighborhoods that are hotter than others, that are subjected to dangerous levels of pollution than others, is not an accident. It was a result of redlining. Those communities where banks were very loath to give money to local businesses or local people that wanted to buy houses. I was curious, did we see that here in Seattle? And the answer is yes, we did. And so I took a little drive, and I'd like you to go on the drive with me to see what I found that backed that up. Understand that major thoroughfares, such as Interstate 5 that I'm driving on right now, both absorb and re-radiate more heat than areas simply covered with soil or turf or vegetation. And they're also subject to much higher levels of air pollutants, things such as carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, benzene, particulate matters, each of which is tied to health impacts. So we're going to check the connection between income level, pavement, trees, and heat right here in Seattle. This first neighborhood has been considered desirable for decades. You'll see plenty of trees, big trees here, and it's several miles away from the nearest highway or interstate. So let's check the temperature right here in Queen Anne. There we are. We're looking at 75 degrees. Now we're heading to a neighborhood that was long subject to redlining. It's called the Georgetown neighborhood. Many of the people living here live near or even below the poverty level. You'll find plenty of pavement, you won't find many trees. So let's check the temperature here. 82 degrees. That's 7 degrees warmer than in Queen Anne. Now that's exactly what the published research showed, that in city after city, low-income neighborhoods tended to experience temperatures 5 to 20 degrees hotter than high-income neighborhoods. And so that 7 degrees was on the low end. So the question that we're led to is the impact on human health. And again, Laudato Si relates to the fact we need to strengthen the conviction we are all one human family, and that often no measures are taken until after people's health has been irreversibly affected. It's like, oh, I guess maybe we should be doing something about that now. This was a publication of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a few years back, and it showed that those groups, Latinx Americans and Black Americans, are typically subjected to far more pollution than they are responsible for producing. Whereas many of us here, white Americans, tend to be exposed to less pollution than we're actually responsible for. We remember last year when Seattle had the worst air quality in the world, worse than Beijing and worse than New Delhi. That was a dubious honor. The World Health Organization tells us that wildfire smoke and other pollutants, air pollution, responsible for a quarter to a third of the deaths from heart attack, stroke, lung cancer, respiratory disease. They call it the new tobacco. Another study, and I found this really stopped me in my tracks, Harvard University, University of City of London, and University of Birmingham did a study and concluded, these are epidemiologists, a variety of other people, that 1/5 of all deaths worldwide are the result of exposure to fossil fuel particulates and also gases. In the United States, that relates to 678,000, rounding it off, per year. That's about 1 every 52 seconds. So in the time that we covered maybe a couple slides, there's been another death that would have been attributed to that. And in the midst of the pandemic, 200 medical journals, remember this question, stated that the climate change is the greatest threat to public health, above non-communicable diseases and above COVID. And as I said, they were the leading medical journals all throughout the world. We go from environmental injustice to generational injustice. As Laudato Si tells us, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to the young people now growing up? As I look out, I see many of you are undoubtedly parents, grandparents. My wife and I just became grandparents about 1.5 years ago, not quite. And that figures very much into why I emphasize this so much personally. One of the things that we're seeing, and I had not even heard of this before, is climate anxiety. As Ron mentioned, I do this TV program that had been started by Father William Tracy, who just passed away last October at the age of 103. And he was still very active up until virtually the end. One time I had a young woman, we were having a birthday celebration, I think he was 101, and she said, boy, I've heard so much about him, I'd like to meet him. She was working at when Camp Corey took it over. And I said, well, I'd be glad to introduce you to him. Here he is coming here, and he was just coming down the hill. And she said, that's him at 101? But he had that vigor. But we did this program, and one of the programs was on confronting youth stress and suicide. 2 of the parents there had children that had died from suicide. The woman in the middle, an Episcopal priest, is a crisis intervention counselor. She had gone out to New York during the 9/11 or after 9/11, a lot of times when there were shootings in different places. And I asked her, I was curious, I said, when you talk to young people, what do they tell you are the major sources of stress? I thought it would be parents, not that we parents ever cause our children stress. Social media, social pressures, things of that sort. This is what she told me. One of the biggest sources of stress that she hears from teenagers is climate change. They wonder if they're going to have a future. And that wasn't just one impression. There was a study conducted by Yale of 27 to 45-year-olds. Essentially, 97% said they're very worried about their children. And this was a continuum, and that was the category of what most of the people answered. Almost 60% questioned whether to have children. We know the importance of our faith. We know the importance of getting young people back in the pews, back in a faith life. And yet, if you have people questioning whether to have children, that's going to be an obstacle. And more than 6% actually regretted bringing children into this world. And they qualified that saying, it isn't because we don't like being parents. It's we feel that it's unfair to bring them in to face the problems that they're facing and will face. The American Psychological Association came out with a guide for clinicians, counselors, on how to tackle this issue of climate anxiety. And they have a list of symptoms that show up, obviously, for other things as well, but that can be sequels from climate anxiety. It's one of the things that I can associate with. It's essentially a form of pre-PTSD, and covering Mount St. Helens in 1980, my job changed from explaining the science to helping locate bodies. And that is really tough work. And it had a very deep impact on me. And I saw that some of the things that I had used to recover from that really can help a lot. And I've got some bookmarks that I just brought along as a little pass along for some strategies that I found to be helpful. I think when we listen to all this stuff, and some of you that are watching on camera out there via Zoom or later on, thinking, boy, this Renner guy is really a downer. You know, I don't want you to feel depressed by the time you walk out of here. And one of the things that I always think of before I tackle something like this is what Jesus told us, be not afraid, I go before you always. It's so important to remember. Professor Michael Mann is one of the luminaries of climate science in the United States, and he has said one of the problems we face is doom-mongering. It's overtaken denial as a threat to climate action because there are groups that are manipulating that. It's in their interest not to have changes, and they figure if people are discouraged, they'll just give up and let business as usual go on. So we don't want to give in to that. That's a manipulation. How are we called to respond, and also, how can I respond? So I say there are 3 steps. There's community, there's action, and there's prayer. And you have community right here. I'm very impressed and gratified at the number of you that turned out. And I know that Connie over here is part of your climate group or your creation care group. And I'm sure, I know there are a couple of other people here, I bet you'd love to have some more people working with you as well. They do very good work. We see each other on conference calls from time to time. But being in community both eliminates the feeling, or at least reduces the feeling, that I'm in this on my own. We are asked, I think, when we're in community, how do we define ourselves? Shop till you drop. You see lots of ads on TV of that sort. With apologies to Rene Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am, I think one of the mottos of this consumer age might be, I consume, therefore I am. I liked very much a quote that I heard from Jessica Koblentz, who's a professor of theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And she said, it's a cursed existence to have nearly everything and yet focus on what one doesn't have. And she drew an example of Adam and Eve. They lived in this Garden of Eden, all this bounty, all this beauty. We're in intimate relationship with God, and yet what was it? It was the one thing they didn't have that they focused on. By contrast, you had people who had very little listening to Jesus on the hillsides, and they didn't have food. They didn't worry about that. They had the presence of Jesus. They were in that presence, and they had faith that the other stuff that really mattered would show up, and it did. And so I think that's a very real judgment on where we're at with consumerism. Another example is the Tower of Babel. That sort of reminds me, social media was invented with the idea of bringing us together. I don't think it's really done that very well. As we consider what can we do and what should we do as a group, we need to understand the concept of Earth overshoot. If all the Earth's population consumed at the level of the U.S., we'd need not 1, not 2, but 5 planets right now. We're currently consuming at a level of 1.6 planets, and I don't know about you, I only see 1 underneath me right now. My mother, who passed away a couple of years ago, came to one of the presentations I did, and she didn't like this slide very much, because she said, people are going to think that's me, and that's how you were raised. And I can say, Mom, and I told her after that, Mom, people are not going to believe that. She was a very outgoing, genial, warm-hearted person. But how many of us have heard, as our mothers say, we're eating ourselves out of house and home, and that's a reality of what we're doing. We need to recognize that every purchase is a vote. It's an expression of what you value, what you support, what you deem to be acceptable in terms of behavior. A couple of things just to keep in mind. Factory farms, a source of cheap processed meat, are releasing chemical and infectious compounds into rivers and streams and wastewater around them. And the ones that are most exposed to that are typically the people that cannot afford to live in higher income areas and are probably being paid minimum wage. Another, large-scale livestock ranching is reshaping the planet. 55 square feet of rainforest, now I can't measure, but I suspect it's about like maybe 3 by maybe 20, so that's a little bit more than that. That much land is needed for every hamburger consumed. And as a result, hamburger has gotten a new, and believe me, I enjoy a good hamburger, but it's been nicknamed the coal of the food world. Now, we're in Lent, and one of the things that you might do from some of the information we're giving is saying, given that big ecological footprint, can I maybe give up beef for Lent and maybe reduce it afterward? That's something Sue and I have done as part of our Lenten journey. So reduce, reuse, and recycle. This is going to be beyond the age of some of you here, but some of you may remember the nuclear age when we were concerned a lot about fallout, and they'd have these what we called PSAs, public service announcements, and it was like, what happens in the event of a nuclear attack?
Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover.
Now, how many of you really believe that throwing a picnic tablecloth over your head would protect you from fallout? I can just see the forecast. Oh, today there's a 90% chance of glowing after being exposed to fallout. Tomorrow in our weather forecast, only a 60% chance. You can go back and have your picnic. We know that wouldn't be it. And therefore, it illustrates the limits of individual action, that we need to take systemic action as well. That it's very often a matter of supply, what a demand has been created or what has just been put into us. There's a new phrase that's being used a lot, greenwash detected, marketing claims versus reality. And it's unfortunate, but we've seen many examples of that. How many of you remember the ad showing the man who was portrayed as a Native American crying when he saw litter along the side of the road? Okay. It was a good ad. We need to be concerned about litter, but it was funded not by a conservation group, but by the soft drink manufacturers and bottlers. They wanted to stave off mandatory recycling and the deposits on bottles. And they managed, I think there were 5 or 6 states that passed that, but the rest of them, as a result of campaigns and efforts to sway public opinion, did not. We've seen this sort of greenwashing also occur. We know that the Exxon scientists told their corporate leaders that 40 years ago, human-caused climate change is real, and its effects are also going to be real and harmful. We've seen this more recently with the big derailment in Ohio. Part of the report said that they were dedicated to, let me get a little closer so I can read it, to environmental stewardship, safety, and deliberate action for a better planet. Yet when you look at the reality, there have been 4 straight years of increased accidents. They demanded rollback of safety rules that were put in place in 2014, and that the derailed train didn't meet the standards for high-hazard flammable trains, which obviously it was. So this is where we need to question sometimes some of these messages that are putting out. Our fellow Catholics have devised 2 possible approaches to this in addition to other activity. One is disinvestment, the other is engaged investing, and you have to decide which of either of these works for you. In any case, disinvesting is becoming more and more frequent, including the Irish Bishops' Conference, which the late Father Tracy would have loved seeing them listed as the first bishops' conference to disinvest. The Vatican, a variety of Catholic charities, universities, even individual diocesan groups, and also even some parishes are beginning to say we need to think about the decisions we're making with the investments. The other, and there's a great group called Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center, and I bet with your Social Justice Committee, you're aware of that already. They have a subgroup called Northwest Coalition for Responsible Investment. And what they do is they say, sometimes the better route is to go ahead and take part, to hold shares in some of these corporations, because then we can float shareholder resolutions and proxies, and vote with our proxies to try to effect change. So there are 2 different approaches there. In the guides, in the handouts that we have, it has some of those references for you on that. The last aspect, and I mean this because it comes to the core of what sustains me in this, as a meteorologist, it's sometimes a little bit like the atmosphere, like a doctor seeing a patient that doesn't have the best prognosis. It can get very discouraging, and prayer is a real refuge for me. I think very much we can take inspiration from St. Francis, who would retreat to prayer, to contemplation, to silence, but also the love of nature around him to remind him what it was that he was following that ministry, and then also being active and embracing the poor, the disabled, the sick. There was a story that I read very recently about a young woman who is a social justice advocate, and she met up one of her professors who was, I'm making hopefully some points for when I go home, a Franciscan friar, who said, you know, you're going to run dry. You do not have the life of prayer and silence necessary to sustain the work you are doing. This has to be a foundation that you build for it. I was interested that Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory I, said, we must move from the secrecy of inward meditation to the wide space of active life, but then return to contemplation, because we will too speedily freeze if we do not return. It has to be a cycle. It's self-feeding, it's self-sustaining. We talked about St. Francis going out and refilling himself in nature. We have to do the same thing. We have to remind ourselves, why is it we care? It's the loved ones that we care about. It's the beauty of the environment that still is there. That's our Siberian Husky, Lucy, by the way. She loves the snow. But take time to rest, take time to play in the outdoors, and take time to explore. I mentioned that my wife and I were in Italy just this last fall. We were walking, after having done some hiking in the Dolomites, we walked into the great cathedral in Milan. And Sue caught my attention, and she said, look at that, how the light is coming in through the windows and painting these otherwise drab columns with beautiful array of colors. And as we talked about it a little bit more, we said, you know, it's like the illumination, the inspiration of God is pouring through us in all the different colors of our life experiences and motivations, and shows how we, through that, passing through that inspiration and illumination from God, can change in a beautiful way all the problems that we're encountering. And it's true. It's true. What I think, when I talk about prayer, one of the things that I find has been very useful is an earth examine. And this is one, and there's one in the packet from the Jesuits. Can I accept God as always present, that there is always light? How is God prompting you to confront the problems with his house? What thoughts emerge, and are you including environmental sins in your examination of conscience and reconciliation? So you're going to have a chance to see Father Vu, a little bit later on, so we're going to expect some of those to be brought up. But it is, I think, an important way to expand our regard of where we're hitting the mark and where we're missing the mark. St. Francis heard the command, Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is falling into disrepair. The command to us now is go and repair God's house, all of creation, which, as we see all too well, is falling into disrepair. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk with you tonight. Thank you. I believe Ron is going to offer a little closing thing, and then that way, if you need to get home, we certainly understand, but if you want to stick around and ask any questions or make some comments, I'll stick around as well.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We do have a small token of our appreciation, which we would like to
Thank you.
offer you.
Well, thank you. Oh, thank you. Wonderful. Oh, that's nice. Exactly.
Again, thank you, Jeff. We're grateful that you were able to spend this time with us this evening. And we also want to thank everyone here for coming this evening, for joining us either in person or remotely via live stream. Tonight we've had an opportunity to learn more about the crisis facing our common home and some of the practical things that we can do to protect and preserve it. And incidentally, if anyone is interested, we do have the Laudato Si blog on the SJV website. If anyone is interested in joining in the work and coming up with ideas for posts, in writing posts and doing research for blog posts, we'd love to have you join us. You can speak to either Connie. Connie, can you stand, please? Or to myself. So let's close together. Father, did you want to do the closing prayer? Okay, let's close by together praying a prayer for our earth in the handout that we've received. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Once again, we want to thank you for joining us. And as we leave, let us remember that as a people of faith, we are being sent out into the world to take what we've learned and to translate it into practical action, and through it, to express our love and our respect for God's creation. So once again, thank you for coming, and Jeff and I will be available for any questions. Thank you.
Yes. It probably is a part of that, but those are the vents that are typically at the boundaries of what we call plates, typically where they're spreading apart, and I think that's a very small part. What we're more concerned about is as temperatures rise over the Arctic and the tundra and the permafrost, where that's melting and that methane is being released. Methane overall, in terms of volume, is a smaller source than CO2, but methane is multiple times more potent than CO2 is. So it's something we really need to take into account. But in terms of the amount that's coming out of those subterranean deep ocean vents, that I don't think is a major proportion that's concerning. And that's been going on, those vents have been going on as long as the Earth has been a planet. Yes? Given the use of resources, we don't have enough planet. We're being, I think that could possibly be a, Mm-hmm. There's that very real disconnect and imbalance. We see ocean nations. One of the images that strikes out in my heart is, I think it was Tonga. I think the president of Tonga was signing a demand for other nations to compensate them and to come up with means to go ahead and trying to ameliorate the effect of ocean rise. There are entire islands that are being washed under sea or being threatened with that very, very soon. And I think at real heart there are a number of questions there, but I think what a lot of theologians have said is that the issue really comes down to what we expect on our levels of consumption and what the offshoots are of those levels of consumption. And, very much we've become a throwaway culture, and I think that's one of the things we need to take into account and begin to change. Yeah.
Jim, my question actually ties into that. If you could mention to us, I know there's some wonderful groups, and probably your parish knows too, but that are working together to buy less, to commit to not buy
Yes.
for a year, and trading with each other in communities. And I think even our Finn Hill has a website that works. I'm not sure. I'd like to find out more about some of those kinds of.
Can anybody speak to that in your neighborhood? Because you'd know much more about that than I would. But there are some groups that you can trade that. I see a finger being pointed. Buy Nothing Finn Hill. Your people can talk to her people. Yes. Mm-hmm. Transportation is a major source. I think there's a lot of work going on there, but there's also, I think, the impact and the necessity, and I think a lot of companies are rethinking as a result of COVID and as one offshoot, that do they really need in-person conferences? There are times that that's important, but one of the things that you can do, and I'm sort of giving away something that we're working on, but you can buy what are called carbon offsets. That part of the trick of that is do those carbon offsets that you buy, and they're not that much. When we went to, I think we went to Montreal and Quebec City just about a year, well, no, it wasn't quite a year ago. We bought carbon offsets, and what it does is it goes into groups that are trying to work to counter the effect of CO2. So those are available. One of the things our larger Creation Care Network is trying to do in this area is devise a way that people could go ahead and put funds in a trackable way that would counter some of the problems in the Pacific Northwest region. And so that's very much on the, we're very much in sort of the baby step version of that. But carbon offsets is something that can be very, very useful to that. But of course, if you can not end up taking motorized transportation, if you can get motorized transportation that's more fuel efficient, and certainly then the carbon offsets, that would make a major contribution. I do know some of the, I know Boeing is experimenting with biofuels and trying to see if those are viable. So there are a variety of different approaches on that. Certainly we are called, I think, to try to limit, and just like any purchase, is this really needed? Sometimes it is. Yes? Mm-hmm. Factory farming is probably one of the most problematic in terms of meat, beef, pork, and chicken is generally less problematic. Seafood is less problematic in some areas. There are some species of fish that are caught where they drop these large nets that scrape along the bottom of the ocean and damage the environment there. There are some very good articles on that. If you just do something on food's ecological footprint, I think you'd find a lot of information. But if you can limit like beef and pork in favor of other things, you'll be making a major contribution on that. You know, if we could up our sources of nutrition from vegetables and fruits and things like that. Fortunately, they haven't shown that pasta is a problem, and I find that together with chocolate is a major source of happiness for me. But no, seriously, I think if you do that, there was an article, I can't remember if it was in the Washington Post or the New York Times recently, where they did just that, and they said these are the sources of foods that result in more pollution. These are the sources that are less polluting. Yeah.
You also mentioned meatless meat products.
Yeah.
Which are becoming more and more
Right.
needy.
Ron mentions meatless products. I can't remember the brand of faux hamburger that we get, but or Beyond Burgers that we use. And we actually had friends, and he loves his steak. And they live in Bend, Oregon, and they said, "Hey, have you ever tried these?" We said, "No, have you?" He said, "Yeah, those are great." And it was like, I never believed I'd hear that out of his mouth, but we like them. We have them on a regular basis. And so there are meatless products that are out there. And certainly, not necessarily, I mean, if you're called to a vegetarian lifestyle, that's wonderful. The footprint is much less. But it's just look at the balance of what you eat. It can make a big difference on that. Father. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Redlining is illegal now, but I see a nod here, so I might defer to you, and then I can add something extra on that.
Times today, there was an article about a grant that was given to the Georgetown area to come up with plans to improve the greenery in the area and open spaces and parks to go along with or to take out some of what's there now.
Mm-hmm.
So it was in the paper today.
Part of the problem is that with that cheaper land and with people that maybe didn't have the influence, it was easier to locate industrial firms there. It was easier to build large highways and so forth. And I think there's more and more consciousness and activism on that route. But as you were mentioning, there are some definite steps to start getting more vegetation. As we've traveled, one of the amazing things is you'll go through places and their roofs are covered with vegetation. That helps a great deal as well, both in filtering pollution and then also reducing the temperature differential. Mm-hmm.
They started getting funding to do more about it.
We just did a program as part of Challenge on the Black Farmers Collective, and they have two farms, one near Yesler Terrace, and I think they got land, I think it was from the county, and they are developing farms there to get around the problem of food insecurity, you know, what they sometimes call food swamps, where all they have is maybe some, I don't want to put a finger on any one, but fast food, let's say, that's the only source, and that we interviewed one of the people on that. One was a retired science teacher, and then one was a young woman who just developed an interest in farming and saw that was something that she could really do to make a difference in her life and in her neighbors. So I think there's a lot of awareness being generated on that. Mm-hmm.
To the tune of $500 million, right? And the comment
Right.
and continue to pollute, but at least we have the money for it. Where does that make any sense in the compromise?
Sometimes it does not, and that's been one of the criticisms. I can tell you that when we would have conferences for the American Meteorological Society, which I belong to, they scoped out very carefully what the sources were of those carbon offsets and how they were being used. And the problem is as anything, there are some that will take advantage of that, and that's where we need to be well informed and to apply some pressure to our elected leaders and even the corporate leaders at the whole idea of disinvestment or engaged investing, to go ahead and say, no, that does not make sense. And one of the struggles that we're facing is that increasingly, and I don't know the situation right here, but increasingly fewer and fewer communities have local newspapers that can keep an eye on that sort of thing. A friend of mine, Ron Judd, who used to work for the PI, was hired away to work at the, I think it's Bellingham. Well, it's up in Bellingham, and they started up a new newspaper. And they found, and there was some research done by the League of Women Voters that basically showed that having a local newspaper reduced the amount of money that was being wasted, and by increasing the accountability. And some of that is just getting the information. But you're absolutely right. There's the carbon offset field has had some good stories, and there have been some bad stories, and it's being informed and speaking out where it's not good. Question?
I've got a few thoughts. I hope I can share them clearly. So, my background's economics. I have an MBA from the Wharton Business School. I went to Georgetown undergrad, studied economics and finance at the graduate level. But when we talk about pollution, it's really a byproduct of industry, of the economy. And I was going right back to the very first swirly thing. It picks up around the 60s, 70s, 80s. And
Right.
It really picks up. I just wanted to point something out. We look at this as greed and everything. In the early 70s, the percentage of the global population that was living at extreme poverty, and the United Nations and the defined it at $2 a day. We read about how the people in Africa for $30. $2 a day was considered below that, you're going to have a hard time surviving. So back in early 70s, it's well documented, the level of the global community at below that level was 40%. 40%. Economic growth, China becoming an economic engine, eliminated almost all of their extreme poverty. India has grown their economy. I work with Indian people. I used to work with Microsoft. They've really developed. So the level now is around 7 or 8% of the world is below this extreme poverty level, meaning 93% or above. And we've made so much progress. In the turn of the century, 100 years ago, that number was 5% that were above that, 95% below in the late 1800s. So there are a lot of aspects to this stuff. And a lot of that is, producing goods and services. To produce goods, the name says that. It's a good. It's supposed to meet people's needs. I would just, one more comment. I think there's two types of pollution. One is kind of your dirty pollution, litter, chemicals that contribute to people's health, deteriorate. I call that dirty pollution. That's just a side product. We call it a negative externality is the economic term from production. You can have I would call it a clean pollution, not in a good sense, just cleaner, would be CO2. To me, the clean pollution is the hardest one to really address. The dirty pollution, I can consume less, I can recycle, I can maybe drive a cleaner car before I put so many things into the atmosphere. But the carbon one, and when we're talking about global warming, that's the main culprit. So I think when we talk about how do we attack it, I've been thinking about this coming into this discussion today. I really want to try and get clear on what we can do. I think recycling and being more careful about waste, I think it addresses those sort of dirty ones. The carbon one is a much more complicated one. To wrap it up real quick, everybody in this church, everybody in the entire state of Seattle
It does have to be a group effort.
We didn't talk about what's
Yeah.
the solution, but I just hope I can point out the differences between some of the, I'm trying to make some hopefully helpful points. I'm not trying to dispute anything.
I listen to the German radio, and when I listen to the discussions in Germany, that is entirely different from what we hear here in the United States. What you just presented to us is something that they hear every day. Every day in one form or another. The debate that we have in this country, I mean, it just boggles the mind that we are still talking about defining the problem. We're dying here, people are dying, and we are still defining. I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong in this country. And when I listen to the discussions that are going on in Europe, specifically in Germany, because that's my background, it's in a completely different thing. And nobody goes, most people don't go to the store anymore and buy prepackaged stuff. Why are batteries in plastic bags? Why can't I just buy a battery? Why can't I just buy a bag of rice? Why does it have to be all prepackaged and you know, that half of the weight that I'm buying I need to throw away? Those things, it strikes me that when we go visit over there, they are a lot further along than we are. And we are still trying to work around the edges here.
It strikes me that there's an essential element there, and we hear a lot about what is my freedom to do as I like. And I think there's also the unappreciated aspect of what is my freedom from the results or the effects of, you know, what you consider your freedom. And I think there's more when we've traveled and when we've talked to people from other countries in particular, there seems to be more of a concept of group cooperation and integration as opposed to everybody sort of out doing their thing. And I think that's a major part of it too.
Bringing that back to the faith component, to me, dominion has never meant that I dominate over someone. But to me, dominion was always that God gave me a reasoning, thinking brain as a human being. And He expects me to use it. And that's also something that's happening to me.
Yeah. Any other questions or points? Yeah.
I think the thing that bothers me most is we're so much about individualism
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, and not about being a community and caring for each other. And it all reflects on climate change and everything else too, because we do our thing without thinking how we might affect the life of somebody else,
Yeah.
even if they're not our immediate neighbor. If you travel the world and if you've been to African places, then you see it in person. It just breaks your heart.
It does. It does. I, mhm. Oh. I just know that transportation over there, I mean, it's easy to get from one place to the other, and the footprint of that is lower. I wish we had some of those options that, you know, we've taken advantage of when we've been over there. There's a lot more room to roam around on a train, too. I'm sure that's the case. I haven't taken a German train, but I'm sure that's the case. It's much more comfortable. There's more room. You can stretch out a little bit more. And I'm not a guy with long legs either, but I know I welcome that. Let's see, question over here.
Yeah, so other than like consumerism and food and diet choices, is there anything else we could do in our daily lives? Or like what should we be teaching our kids to do to help?
Look at some of the references that I gave you. Let me just grab that sheet because I can refer you to a couple on that. The one is on, let's see, okay. The one is on the environmental or ecological examine. But if you look at the top one, Greener Lent is the practice that Sue and I are doing. That's specifically for Lent. But if you look at Laudato Si Action Platform and Laudato Si Movement and Catholic Climate Covenant, Those are overarching ones that are tied in with the Vatican and a variety of other Catholic-based sources that talk about what you can do and ways that you can organize. And those are very useful. And we have this whole group of the Creation Care Network that is going to be having a conference, when is that? Earth Day, April 22nd. But there are these local organizations can begin to put things into practice, but those have some wonderful tips and suggestions on that.
The Laudato Si blog has a blog post, I think, called "You Don't Have to Be an Environmental Superhero,"
Yeah.
which just lists simple things you can do that
Whoops.
can have a huge impact.
That's on the back right here.
Oh, it is. Oh, right, it is.
Somebody put it there.
Oh, wow.
I'm glad.
So there's that, and then there are small things like putting out a bird feeder, making sure that there's a water source for pollinators, for bees, for wasps, for birds. There are just hundreds of very small things that you can do that can have an impact far beyond anything we can imagine. For example, Marty is very committed to raising bees every year. And bees and all pollinators, in fact, are really under threat. And if they perish, then food insecurity is going to be catastrophic.
One of the best things that you can do is, this sounds really odd, but one of the most inspirational climate scientists that I've talked to is a woman by the name of Catherine Hayhoe. And Catherine has said, she's done a great TED Talk. If you just, go ahead and search Hayhoe, Hayhoe. She said probably the most effective thing you can do is just talk about your concern. Because she said, you look at attitudes and people are concerned, but one of the things that they say is they don't hear anybody talking about it. So they sort of say that, why should I be concerned about it? If you just, talk in a non-confrontational way, with people that maybe are on the fence. There are some people that you're never going to convince. You and I talked about that a little bit beforehand. But if you talk to those people that are on the fence or maybe believe but don't know what they can do, but share your concerns, share some of the things that you've learned and some of the things that you've heard that are not true, real difference. Just even at school, there's a lot of schools that are organizing ecological clubs. And one of the things that we're doing in our parish group is we're talking, in fact, in a couple of weeks, talking with the middle school students to say, we'd like your ideas. What would you like to add to this? Because frankly, we're going to be dealing with this a couple more decades. You're going to be dealing with a lot longer than that. Well, and I think that's true. And I think also you'd be amazed at the number of great ideas that they already have and concerns they share. And it's a matter of saying, okay, teach the adults. What do you want to do? We used to have a saying, and this dates me, but back in the 60s and 70s, don't trust anybody over 30. Fortunately, they've sort of gotten away from that.
It's now 80.
It's 80, yeah. And there are some cases that it's older than that. But I think those are key elements too, is simply be willing to talk. They talk about influencers, and I hear that and I sort of cringe. But there are a lot of good influencers out there too that people need to hear, and each of us can be an influencer. Sure. Oh.
We have two recycling events with styrofoam a year. So a good thing to do is simply save your styrofoam to the next recycling event. Styrofoam. in the planet, and it probably, I mean, how long it's going to last since it's fairly new is unknown, but the estimates are that it won't fully degrade until 1,000 or 2,000 years from now.
There's actually a new rock that's called plastiglomerate that geologists have discovered. And it's basically plastic that's been bonded together with sand, various other types of garbage that they are finding in the oceans. And some of the geologists say it's going to be used to find the date of the period when the environmental degradation was the worst. And, I was sort of stunned when I saw that, because I've got a fairly good background in geology, and I thought, I never heard about that. And at the Seattle Aquarium, they do educational projects because we know that the amount of plastic we consume in the form of microplastics is on the, it's approximately equivalent to a credit card each week. And we know that those are hormone disruptors. I don't have any medical background. Our son is the one with that, but it's not good stuff for you, right? And
I know that from reading the medical journals.
yeah.
They're related to ovarian cancers,
Mm-hmm.
related to male infertility, and also, to a lesser degree, they disrupt female infertility. And then, obviously, they're all carcinogenic,
Yeah.
highly carcinogenic.
It starts to do, I'm sorry.
To make one comment, so I agree it's good to talk about it and, raise awareness. I would also suggest people get well educated about this. There's a lot of different, this is really a very complicated
Mm-hmm.
issue. I'll just give you an example. We talk about let's limit fossil fuel production, okay? We'll make less of it, we'll burn less of it. Well, that'll raise prices because there's less of it to go around. And when the price of fuel goes up a lot, like it did last couple of years or so, double, the people that are most negatively impacted by that are the poor people that you're talking about, that we're saying that we really want to help the most. As Catholics, as Christians, it's the, you have the preference for the poor. It's not always apparent when you do one or two things, but there's a lot of cycles that go on, a lot of repercussions that go on.
Some of that comes down to the factor of being willing to pay a little bit more, either individually, in what you buy at the supermarket or other places, and as a society being willing to come up with some aids for people that are being adversely affected from those increased prices, or subsidizing less polluting forms of transportation as well. Yeah.
This age, at this time, it's difficult because of polarization. This is such a big issue. There's got to be a role for politics.
Well, there definitely is, because politics, by its very definition, is confronting and solving problems affecting the commons. That's the textbook example of that. But, unfortunately, we've seen that devolve over periods of time. It didn't used to be that environmental issues were that much of a political hot potato. And I think part of that, and it isn't just from getting together with your group and talking to them, it's we've got to talk across borders to the degree we can, and so that more and more people begin to realize this is impacting them. And some of that is the power of story. And some of that is showing up and letting them know what determines what you're going to support. Part of it is just, it's very easy, and if you were to come into our house, you might be surprised at who watches more TV news than the other person, and it ain't me. I was a part of that world for a long time, and it's like there's a certain level that you can absorb, and there are some things I'd just rather get through the newspaper or online. But the key is to be informed and to become active. And that's why I said community, action, and prayer. All of those come together, and you've got a group here. I listen to this, and very often, this is probably one of the longest Q&A sessions that I've been involved with, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful. But it shows me there's passion here, and what you can achieve as a parish community So you've got two groups that are very much involved in this. If you're not already doing so, get involved with that, and you can make a real difference. Thank you. Have a good evening. You bet. My pleasure. You know, I'll just say one parting comment, and that is, you know, when initially people started saying, oh, you need to carry your own bags to the supermarket, that's so tough. People whined about that, and they'd complain about it. Look at how second nature it's become for most people. You know, change can happen.